Thank you and welcome. What a great start already, isn't it? I've already chatted to 4 people who I think are inside my head and have already heard my speech. Because frankly, there's bits that everybody has already shared. We've talked about education. We've talked about career changes. We've talked about breaks in your life when children changes where you're going. But there's an extra question I want to ask you all to think about. I want to think about the baggage you bring with you around finance. I want you to think about how money was talked about in your house when you were growing up. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a taboo subject and there was silence everywhere. So if you have that thought in your head, you'll realise that we all bring things with us. So what I'm going to share with you today as a sort of framework is my own personal journey. And I've had a journey where I've gone from a ballet teacher, yes, really, through to one of the country's most qualified financial advisors. And I was very lucky to have won the Female Financial Advisor of the Year several years ago, which was a wonderful tribute. And I'm going to share with you some really personal things as well, things that have made me the person I am today, and those lessons that I learnt en route. So as I said, I started off as a ballet teacher. Why? My mother was a ballet examiner. What else could I do? It was one of those things, it was in the family. And so by age 18, I'd actually taken over her dance school. My life path was set. Well, clearly not, but it was there for me. And then you know those things that come along in your life, those life events that happen, the things that change who you are totally from the inside out. I was 19 when the first one happened to me, and I had a car accident, and my beloved grandma who lived with us died as a result. Now, as you can imagine, that changed who I am totally and utterly. For the next couple of years, I had no idea who I was. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And we were actually on the way back from me teaching a ballet lesson when it happened. I didn't want to dance. I didn't want to be involved. So where do you go when you don't know what you want in life, when you have no purpose? Well, in my life, I've been really lucky to have people come into it who've inspired me or shown me opportunities that I never knew I could have. And at that time, it was a boyfriend who said, look, why don't you go and do a degree? You sort of witter on about English and Shakespeare the whole time. Why don't you go and do that? So that's exactly what I did. I popped into one of the admissions things and said, can I chat to somebody about joining? They brought out Professor. I waffled on about Shakespeare. He went, great, start in September. I am not joking. That is exactly how it did. In fact, my boyfriend sat there reading the Times in the background while it happened. And I loved academia. Oh my goodness, I loved my degree so much. I thought I'd found my passion in life. This is what I wanted to do. But I got a 2-1. And back in the 80s, you didn't get a grant for a PhD in the study of female directors in the West End on a 2-1. So it was time to rethink it. Again, what was my purpose? What was I here to do? So I went into a bit of office work. I tried a bit of recruitment. That definitely wasn't for me. And then I happened to own an Apple Mac. And again, it was one of those fortuitous things. Somebody said, well, you clearly know what a computer looks like. Why don't you go into tech? And this is the conversation I had earlier with somebody. It was a bit like that. For most of us at that time, tech was a male-dominated area. So I went into sales. In fact, I spent 17 years in tech. Yeah, I am older than I look. No. So 17 years spent in an industry I fell into. But you know what I did right from the beginning? I did what I bet most of you have done. You went, I'm going to be so much better than the men in the office. I'm going to work harder. I'm going to study more. I'm going to do longer hours. I'm going to do whatever's needed. And that's exactly what I did. And actually, about a month after I'd started, I got a call from a publishing house to say, help, we've had a fire. All our computers have gone. We need a complete office set. It was 9 o'clock at night. I was the only one there. So of course I took it. It was commission industry. Of course I went with it. And I can tell you, most of the guys in the office were furious. They all thought it should have been theirs, but I held on to it. And I remember when that commission cheque came through. Now, bear in mind, we are talking about maybe just into the 1990s there. I got a cheque for £1,800 net of tax. You see, it's burnt in my brain, this. That was more than my maintenance grant had been for a year. That was incredible. And it was a responsibility. What did I do with it? So I remember my dad had told me he had an account with the Halifax. There was a Halifax opposite the office, so I walked into the Halifax, opened an account, and I put half of that cheque into it. Half. That was massive. And at that point, I learnt something really, really important. I learnt it feels really good to put money aside. Not just have the money that was here for today, but actually have something for this future self of me. The one that wanted to have fun down the line, or the one that wanted to feel secure later on. So I put that money aside. As you can imagine over the years, money got added to, money got taken out, because that's what happens, isn't it? Not always to have fun, I'm afraid. Sometimes it's just for very boring, practical things. Now, if I tell you that some of this was happening around 1992, for those of you with longer memories, you will know it wasn't a great time. In fact, that not very great time happened just as I was on honeymoon with my first husband. So you will gather from that terminology, yes, I have been through a divorce. I asked you at the beginning to think about the message your family gives you around money, the one you grew up with that you don't always understand. I can basically say our parents gave us two different messages, and that is exactly why we ended up divorced. I believed money was something you respected. My parents grew up with the idea that if you didn't have enough, you were going to be practically in the poorhouse. And it was scary not to have something behind you. In fact, we used to have a laugh about my mother that she always seemed to have a little bit of money squirreled somewhere that she would produce at necessary times. We actually called her Safe Cracker Eaton because we didn't know where the money came from. And he came from a background where savings wasn't something they did, because you could always go and earn a bit more. But actually, neither family had been to university or done a degree. In fact, my parents left school at 14 and 16. There was no difference. It was just something that happened in our families. Now, we got on honeymoon. Black Wednesday happened. But that's not why we got divorced. On Black Wednesday, I found out he had a lot of debts. So just as interest rates went up to 15%, he told me about his overdraft, his store cards, his loans to friends, his credit cards. They were thousands and thousands of pounds. From his point of view, it's not a problem. The money tree would pay for it. From my point of view, I went into absolute blind panic and thought, what can I do? And this is where I learned a really, really important lesson. Having a plan can help you in any situation. Now, I know everybody here, not everyone feels that writing a plan is the best thing, but what I can promise you is, around something like money, it is really, really important. Whether you write it down, put it on your computer, don't just have it in your head. It is important to have something tangible that you're saying, I've achieved something. And that plan needs a few components to it. First and foremost, I had to know what we spent every month. So work out your expenses. And that's really important, to be honest with yourself. You know those Costa coffees that don't count? Things like that. Unfortunately, they do. And you have to write them down. It's a bit like a diet, isn't it? If it's on someone else's plate, it doesn't count. Yes, it still does. So I wrote down all of our expenses. And then I took the proverbial red pen through everything that was truly, truly discretionary. I worked out what our earnings were. Now, this was forcing a transparency into our relationship that hadn't been there before. And one of the things I can really recommend to everybody is to have as much transparency in your family unit. Without that, you're both working on different goals and agendas. And that can be really hard if you've come from a family that has always told you that talking about money is almost bad manners. It is still there, built sometimes into our culture, isn't it? And if you can share that now with your children and start to unpick that messaging, even if it's hard with your spouse or your parents, then I think that would start to make a change to this, which is why I was delighted when we talked about financial education. The really key thing to think about is if you are having conversations, you want them both to have the same goals and agendas. Now, my goal at that time was repay these horrific debts. So I wrote down all the expenses, I wrote down all the income. I was still in a commission-based industry, so I worked very hard to earn as much as I could. And I did the other thing, I wrote down everything we had, every debt, every asset. Believe me, the debts outweighed the assets by a very long way. And then I worked out which ones were costing the most. Now, if you've got assets, you'll want to look at the ones that give you the most returns, as in the tax efficiency, things like that. At that stage, I was simply looking at, oh my goodness, do you know what store cards charge you? What the bank charged you every time they wrote a nice letter telling you you needed their help more? And all of that sort of thing. And then I prioritised which were the worst, and let's eat away at those first. And we can go through these things. And actually that taught a really important lesson about financial education. It was only the first steps, and I can honestly say, if I'd had the tools that I have now, back then, I'd be worth significantly more. Because I didn't have those tools young enough. But it's never, ever too late to start. And I could tell you that because after 17 years in tech, going through 2 children with my now husband. I don't like to say current husband, it sounds the wrong message. And 2 stepkids and building money up and spending it. Do you remember those stages when your kids were really little and you were trying to work out career versus being a mother and actually seeing your husband so you remember what they look like? That time was such a period where I realised this is not financial freedom. Now, I remember being 36 weeks pregnant back when maternity leave was 18 weeks. Who recalls that one? And I got an extra 6 weeks that was actually at part pay, and the rest was at £62.20. I had to look that up a week. So you wanted to preserve all of that time, don't you, for your child when they're born? As a result, when I felt really ill before I gave birth, I hid it. There was even one day when I left a meeting, walked out in the car park, threw up in the car park, walked back in the meeting, so I didn't get made to start my maternity leave early. That is not financial freedom. That is a wage slave. That is you're in somebody else's power. You need money to give you time. And I didn't have that time with my first child. My second was better. It was 5.5 months. The rules had changed. You'll gather it was 2001, 2003, so the rules changed just about then. And going through these things showed me how important it is to have that ability to take time when you need it. Now, the reason I stopped in tech was actually down to my daughter. She doesn't like to take the blame here, but we like to share things accordingly in our house. And I walked into nursery when she was about 3. And she'd bitten another child and then cried all day. And I stood there and went, what am I doing to my child? Am I such a bad mother? What could I do different? And I literally just phoned my manager on the spot, resigned and left tech that day. I hadn't talked to my husband. I had no plan B. What I did know is I needed to give my daughter that time. Now, one thing I did have is financial transparency with my husband. We had both learned from our first marriages that this wasn't a good thing to hide stuff. We even had a joint account both our salaries went into. Now, that's innovative even today, but meant we had trust. So he could trust me that I would be getting back into work, and that's what I did. I had a lovely friend who said to me, Eliana, you're really, really nosy. Why don't you go into finance? Okay, sounds good. I tried property development. just before 2008. Yes, I'll not say any more about that one. And so I thought, okay, finance. I've got the attribute of nosy. It's quite a lot of exams, isn't it? Yeah, haven't done one since finals. Don't really like most financial advisors. Aren't they just trying to sell you something? Yeah, it's perfect. I'll go into that and then I'll do that. So I picked up the first manual he gave me, opened it up, and it was absolutely so boring. I cannot tell you how boring it is. All of the compliance stuff. It was the FSA then. Who wants to know about the FSA? I wanted to know what finance meant to my life. I wanted to know how it would give me time, ability to spend with people. So I went through 17 exams. And don't let anyone ever tell you age can stop you. I was, should we say, over 40 at this stage. And I just wanted to achieve this because it gave me two things. It didn't just give me an opportunity of a new career. It gave me an opportunity of a career that would enable me to make a difference to my family. So I took that forward and I brought all the learnings that I'd done from previously, having been through a divorce, having been through death, having been through huge debts, obviously in my first marriage. And I wanted to bring that understanding of all of that life into how we think about money. And I built a fair few, if you like, rules, hot tips, if you like, that can really help. So one of the things that I found, which was really good, is thinking about yourself today and yourself tomorrow as the same person. It's like you want to cuddle it all, your past, present and future, cuddle it all together. Helps when you want to put money aside. If you're like me and you get a buzz out of saving, that's helpful too, but not everybody does that. Mind you, I get a buzz when I stand on the scales and I've lost weight, so, you know, I'm a goal-driven person. If you think about these things, they can make a difference. So every time you earn something extra over and above what you expect, why don't you put half aside for your future self? Because your future self will thank you. Always know what your spending is. Don't lie to yourself. Those calories do count, and that cost of coffee does count. Is it that important to have today, or is there something more fun in your list tomorrow? Have really great bucket lists. Who here has got great bucket lists in writing? Yes, that's what I like. I would love you all to go away out of today and write out your bucket list and put dates and times and maybe even how much it will cost. Because then you're more likely to put money aside for that future self who's going to enjoy that bucket list. So when you're going through these, you've got to actually have a degree of financial education with it. Now you'll see from the slide behind you that I think one of the biggest things we should all learn about is compound interest. There's a lot in financial education, but this is the one that I wish we taught in schools from a young age. I actually did teach my kids about this from a very small age. There was a day I found my daughter, who would have been about 8 at the time, lecturing a guy in Waitrose on the till when he mentioned he'd run out of money this week. And she gave him quite a long lecture on saving money for his future self and how it would benefit him and his wife, she had got to know him that well by this stage, for the future. So compound interest, why do I think it's really important? We've got a little graph. For those of you who are mathematical, you know this, you can have a little sleep. The rest of us, this graph here, if we have a look, the bottom line here is just simple interest. That's the way we tend to think. The compound interest, that's actually what can happen. Now, can you mentally flip that the other way? If I hadn't taken that time to repay those debts, mine would have been a blue line underneath. So that's why compound interest is right and why I think Einstein is totally spot on. 8th wonder of the world. I want you all to be the people who earn it, the blue line. I don't want you to be the people who flip it the other way and have it, you paying it out. So having this knowledge really helps. Now, it's hard to learn as you get older. It's like a new language. It is harder to learn. So the thing I say to everybody is, even if you don't do it for yourself, do it for your family, do it for your kids. Start to learn with them. There's some great books out there on these topics for kids. And don't think they're too young to start. It's not true. Both my kids are at uni, and both of them budget and forecast. So I'm so proud of them, you can tell. I mean, how many times have I mentioned them? They both budget and forecast amazingly. So, after I moved into finance, I thought, I'll write a plan for my new business. So everyone here who's been a new business owner, you wrote a plan? Yeah. You wrote it down, and we had a beautiful plan. I was going to take 5 years to build my business, and during which time my husband would be the main breadwinner to give me time to really build it in the way I wanted. And then I would take over and he could have a nice early retirement. And then life comes along again and goes, no. In our case, it wasn't one lemon thrown at us, it was a host of lemons thrown at us. And we have to all understand this happens to every one of us. This one was a health one. One day my husband couldn't walk. And over the next 18 months, he couldn't function. Our beautiful Georgian house we had, you know, with rooms on every levels, he had to crawl up and down stairs. I mean, hell, he couldn't even drink his own wine. I had to feed it to him out of a straw. It was that bad. And we didn't even know what was wrong with him. He lost his job. I took to creating a plan on the unknown then, which was speed up the growth of my business, sell our house. We moved down to Somerset, take the kids out of private school. I was totally ruthless. There was no option. When you're starting a new business and the other person's salary disappeared, there is nothing you can do. And in fact, in 1 month, my son had done some film extra work, actually, funnily enough, with Steven Spielberg, just name dropping. And he actually earned the most in the household in 1 month. So it was very serious to make these changes. Eventually, we found out that he had an autoimmune condition that's rare and incurable. He had bowel cancer, later on a heart condition, and a genetic cancerous condition, which my son's also inherited. These are really tough things to deal with in any family. It probably took us a decade to really put ourselves mentally and physically and emotionally together in a new structure. And the reason I mention my kids so much is I am in awe that they went through those life events at such young ages, and they are functioning adults at university who I think are quite reasonable. I don't agree with everything they think, but they think they're quite reasonable. And we should be very proud of when we've broken a trend and helped our families to grow. And that is part and parcel of financial freedom. Walking away from those baggages that we grew up with. So anyway, I took this set of lemons, worked with it again with the plan, as I said, and thought about how are we going to take this forward? And what I worked out from it is our biggest attribute we have, and Sarah mentioned this earlier, is ourselves. How we react. We can't control life. We can't control everything around you. All we can do is control ourselves. And by the way, have as many great friends and networks and everything around you as you can. I was at the very beginning of my financial career when this happened. And I didn't have all of the professionals around me I wanted. For example, we got very poor advice from a solicitor for my husband when he lost his job. This made a material difference to us. I now know I would have chosen differently with the knowledge I have today. So one of the things I'd call out to all of you is the old saying, fix the roof when the sun is shining. Put in place all those tedious, boring, and very useful things, such as life cover, protection, illness, good friends. Make sure that when you're busy working, you don't neglect all of that support structure. Not that they're boring, they're wonderful, but when you're working, you tend to get very fixated on one thing because you're paying your future self. And that resilience is vital. And when Whitetree asked me to join them, I knew I'd reached a stage where that resilience was paying off. Why? Because although I had all these financial goals, I have another goal I hadn't mentioned so far. And that goal is to leave a financial legacy. And this is not money for my kids, by the way, much to their disappointment. This is that I get out into the world and I change how we think about money. And whether that starts from little people all the way up to my mother, who's nearly 90 this month, I want the message to come out. We can all own this. We all have the right to the knowledge. It is not a secret. It should be transparent. In our workshop, we're going to go into a lot more details on this. I'm just going to run out of time. I can see I'm going to run out of time. So what I want to just say in a call out to action is trust yourselves to do it. I believe every single person here has the capability to take their own path and achieve financial freedom. Thank you.
Eliana, thank you so much for that, for sharing your journey, I think, with such humility, such honesty, and also with such great humour. Thank you very much indeed. But Eliana, I have one question I'd like to kick off with, and then I will give you the opportunity as well. I guess the interesting thing, there were so many things there that you shared which were, I think, sure, relatable to people in the audience, whether it's those life events. But for me, it was the transparency, which was so interesting. And so I guess, you know, your messages in part is start those conversations, find that transparency. But how do you do that? How do you encourage that within relationships, within marital relationships, family, and also with your friends?
It's really hard, isn't it? Where do you start? You don't tend to share what your salary is with family, and that can be reasonable. Small children have a tendency to want to share with everybody. So how do you actually start those conversations? I think you start with your children, actually. If you have a spouse who's quite secret on these things, hearing you talk openly, talk about what it means, is one path to do it. Because very often we will do something for our children that we won't do for ourselves. And then they have a tendency, as they grow older, to ask more and more and get more and more engaged. In fact, we do quite a lot of work with families to try and help them open those conversations. And I actually do find charity is a good place to start. Why would you support it? What difference would it make? Even if it's only small amounts of money, how much do you think that would achieve? Then it's not just about themselves. There's study after study that says you feel better about money when you're giving to others and helping others. So that's where I'd start.
Thank you. What a fantastic message. Please welcome me in thanking Eliana for such a good speech. Thank you very much indeed.